Hey, what's going up, everybody? Well, it's time for another intermission. Instead of boring you with some babble, I figure we'll start talking about certain subjects, and this time around, we'll start discussing about getting into the hobby. So, where do we start? Let's say your son once saw a couple plastic kits and wanted to start building, or you had a friend who's interested in it, or you've never done it before, or you used to build as a kid and grew up, and then you want to get back into it because now you got spare time, or you just want to try a new hobby to relieve your nerves or something. Well, this is where it gets interesting, because where do you start? Yeah, that's the big question. There's a lot of options out there, not a lot. There's a couple options out there. You can always go to a hobby shop. Problem is with hobby shops is they're few and far between, depending on where you live, and sometimes you may have to travel like an hour or so to go to the nearest one. Unfortunately, hobby shops are starting to go the way of the dinosaur, and the ones that are still standing are either branched into other categories like RC cars, role-playing games, or even just what dollhouse projects or something. Or it doesn't matter what it is. But they're also a very big help, because the person that runs the shop usually has some knowledge, or he's got employees that work there who have quite extensive knowledge and actually build themselves. What if you can't go to one, or there's one too far? Well, you also have the big box craft stores. You got craft stores like Michael's, AC Moore, Hobby Lobby, depending on where you live. In the United States, we got the big three craft stores. So I don't know about the rest of the world. It might be a variety, but I do know they got a lot of hobby shops. But back to the subject. Once you go to these craft stores, they usually have one section, and it's dedicated to it. It's not much, but it's something. They have a limited variety. Most of the time, it's Revell Monogram, sometimes Academy, sometimes Testers. So, but the disadvantage is the people that work there don't have an idea what you're talking about. You might run into somebody who has limited knowledge, if you're lucky, but it's a good starting point. There's also mail order. The only problem with mail order is, even though you got more options available and you can use the internet, there is no social interaction with anybody that runs the place. You could email them to provide some questions, but it's not quite as good as talking to someone face to face. Especially if you're in a hobby shop, you can talk to other fellow modelers. If they're in there, they might help you along. Anyway, so back to that. But the other problem is possibility of fraud, whatever else, what have you, depending on where you order from. So those are the three options you got. And once you make those options, pick the option you have, this is where you start from there. What subject you're going to work on? That's the big question. In my case, I started off in aircraft and armor, but what if you don't want to do that? There's other subjects. You have automobiles, you have ships, sci-fi and armor. And there's also train modeling, which is a whole different category, which we'll explain in the future. But those are your options available. And when you do get into the hobby, and once you make that commitment, where do you start? What kind of model do you pick up? Well, start with something simple. Some, like I said, Revell Monogram still available. Even though half of their molds are about 30 to 50 years old, they're still a good starting point for most modelers. And they're not as expensive either. It's because the disadvantage to a hobby shop is, even though they got the old kits or the cheap kits, they also have the higher end kits, but they're also very expensive. So the more you get into the hobby, the more expensive it gets, and you want to keep it simple first. Now, once you pick the kit you want, now you got to find the tools you need. Just the basics. All you really need is a hobby knife, paintbrushes, paints, and maybe a couple sanding sticks, and maybe some putty. Now, the basics, all you really need is, you need a hobby knife, of course. You can go with a scalpel. They do make craft scalpels. You can go with a razor knife or a utility knife. Those are a little more difficult. Or you can go with this. This is actually a good starting point. This is a X-Acto knife. I've had this thing for years. They do supply them with the plastic model supply stores. The blade you want to use is the number 11. This is the basic Just be careful, they're incredibly sharp. It's sharper than a utility knife or a razor knife. You gotta be real careful with them. And for those of you, and I know some of the modelers sit there and say, oh, I've never, no, you'll get yourself cut. I've actually become victim to that a few times. I've actually cut my hands up quite a bit. Not to the point where I needed stitches or a suture or something, but I've cut my hands up pretty good with it. I still treat that thing with respect. Now for paints, you got your options. You have enamel and you have acrylic. Enamel are toxic and they do require a brush cleaner and certain kinds of thinners. Like think of certain paints that you get over at the hardware store, like say Rust-Oleum, or in a can or in a bottle. The problem is with that stuff is like I said, you do need to clean it. You do need to clean it with a special cleaning solution. They're also incredibly toxic. Not incredibly toxic, but they are pretty poisonous. So you got to make sure they're out of reach of children or something. Then you have acrylics. Now acrylics, not quite as toxic. But the advantage of that is they're water-based, or they're based upon alcohol. So cleaning out the brushes are easy. But once again, just got to make sure they're out of reach. And also you got to make sure if you have kids, make sure they don't get a hold of them. So, but that's enough. But we'll save that for later. Now, once you get your paints, there's also glue. There's a variety of glue. There's liquid cement and tube glue. When you first start out, you just need a simple tube glue, something like this. You could go with the old Testor's glue in the metal tube, but the problem is that stuff is not easy to use, and it doesn't adhere that well. There's also liquid cement, which is here. This is the Tamiya, but that one's a little tricky to use. So stick with the tube glue for now until you get better with it, and then once you learn it, then you learn liquid cement. Liquid cement, however, the advantages over liquid cement and tube glue is you can use a brush, you can apply it over when you're joining things together. Just thin seam, you squeeze it, holding it for about a minute or two. It'll actually start to bond, which makes it a lot easier. But be wary, there's a variety of liquid cements available, and you gotta know which ones you gotta use for the plastic. And most plastic kits are styrene. Think of your soda bottles, some of the things you have around the house. So that's the best way to describe styrene. It's a type of plastic. Once you get then there's brushes. You can get cheap brushes. You can actually, if you're in a craft store, you can actually get like a variety of brushes. They do make variety sets. But as you get improve and you get better, and once you get committed to it, if you get committed to it, you're gonna need better brushes. And brushes are not cheap. It depends on, you don't need anything like sable hair or camel hair, but a nice quality brush works. Like I said, craft stores, hobby shops got them too. They do have a variety of brushes that you could use to your needing. Now, and once you got all that set, I mentioned about sandpaper and sanding sticks. When you're doing like sanding seams and stuff, what I do recommend is get a wet or dry sandpaper. You don't need a heavy grit. All you need to start is like 150 to 600 grit. The Testors does make a hobby starting set, which includes 6 sanding films, a knife, some paints, a drop cloth if you don't want to ruin the table at your house, especially if your wife's going to kill you. Those work great. So if you find a starting set, go with that. And they're not cheap, but you get everything you need, and that's the good thing about it. Once you get everything you need, where are you gonna go? What part of the house are you gonna work it in? Are you gonna work on a kitchen table? Are you gonna find a little spot in your man cave, in a garage? Or are you gonna go in the garage? That's the burning question. Well, depending on where you go, you gotta keep in mind varying factors. If you got kids, you gotta make sure everything's out of reach, they don't get to it. If you got pets, that's another factor. Sometimes they'll get nosy and interfere. You got other people, but always make sure you have some time for yourself if you're going to start doing this. And it takes time. This hobby does take time. Nobody's going to build a masterpiece off the first try. And if you can do that, I want to know your secret. In my case, when I started, I was very quick about things, and I really didn't follow through and everything. So I had my flaws, but as I got better and better, I started learning more, started developing more patience, and I got better and better at it. I've been building for almost 26 years now, and I still remember my first kits that I built. Like I said, but once you commit, or once you make the full decision to commit, it's going to expand big time. You're going to be doing research. You're going to be trying to find other options. You're going to be looking, well, if you don't like the kits in a box, like you said, there's aftermarket stuff available. This is where your hobby shop comes to the advantage. They do have the aftermarket decals you need, and a wider variety of paints, especially as you learn more and more. You start doing more research, you start finding more colors, and a lot of the instructions in a lot of kits, they give a variety of colors, like for certain brands, certain brand paints, or certain brand colors. Make sure you do your research carefully. Take your time once you start going. Take your time. Take a breather, because when you're using glue, it doesn't instantly set unless you use super glue. I don't recommend using super glue right off the bat unless you're just building and just putting it on the shelf. But take your time when you're building, because this is a lot like cross stitching. It's also a lot like building a dollhouse. You got to take the time. You can't just build and then that's it. You gotta remember, a lot of the kits that you're gonna find, they're all one color. They're molded in one color. Most of the time it's gray, but sometimes it'll be in a green. Sometimes it'll be in a black. Sometimes it'll be in a yellow. You don't know. So this is why paint comes in. And once again, with the painting, you got to take the time. You don't want to rush through everything, because this hobby, like I said, it's a lot like cross stitching. You got to follow the instructions. You got to make sure you're using the right colors. Make sure you're doing everything right. It takes time. I mean, you don't want to turn your hobby into something that drives you crazy. This hobby is supposed to help you unwind and relax. But also, if you get your kids into it, it'll actually help their hand-eye coordination. It'll teach them patience, following instructions, and actually learning how to complete something. And if they do it more and more, it actually starts to influence them over time, and it'll actually start spilling into real life. This is a good thing about it. The only other thing I gotta say, once you start going, make sure you have an area where you can put it away, and this way you can get back to it. The good part about this hobby is once you start going, is if you get tired of it, you can stop it, put it aside, let it go for a bit. This is actually a good thing, because it'll let paint dry, it'll let glue dry, and it also gives you an idea of what to do in the next step. Now that everything is said and done, this is where the question is: do you want to build another one, or are you done? Because if you're done, you can always just put everything in storage for a while and just go back to what you're doing. This is the beauty of it. However, if you start getting into it more and more, everything's going to start opening up. The whole new world is going to start opening. And this is where everything starts rolling in. You're going to start picking other options. You don't have to build the same thing over and over again. Matter of fact, even though I work on aircraft, I do take, like modern aircraft, I do take a break from it, and I'll start working in an armor subject. Or if I find both armor and aircraft boring, or just a pain in the ass, I'll do something different. I'll do a model boat. I'll build a car. The only thing, though, is the difference between cars and military is what colors you're going to need. Most cars require basic colors. Matter of fact, you're going to have to go with gloss paints, especially for the car body. It's not like military where you can just paint it with flat paint and you're good to go. Once you start the car body, you're going to have to go with gloss paints. And this is the other thing. Once you're going to realize hand brushing in auto bodies or whatever else, sometimes it takes too much time. Well, they do make spray cans, like spray paint cans, available. However, be careful with what spray cans you're picking up. You can use Rust-Oleum Painter's Touch. You can use the Valspar. You can use Krylon if you wanted to. But check what it is. If it's make sure it's a gloss or a flat. The difference between glosses and flat, it has to do with the luster of the finish. And car bodies, it's gloss is a necessity. Whereas military, you can get away with flat. But the only problem with the regular rattle cans you get from a hardware store or general store is the pigment is a little too thick, so it might hide some detail, very fine detail. This is when you go the give me a few minutes. I just lost my train of thought. However, the paints that I mentioned, like Testers and Humbrol and the like, some of them do make spray cans of the exact same color in the bottle. So you can always use those. It's a finer pigment, but they're a little tricky to use, and you got to take your time using them. And I've stopped using rattle cans for overall finishes about 15 years ago because I learned how to use other tools. But that's another story unto itself. Once you get it, like I said, you just let it take the time to dry. Krylon seems to dry a little faster than the smaller rattle cans from Testers or whatever company. But it's still, once again, the pigment is a little thick. So once you get started, you just go from there. It just depends on what you're looking for. Now I'm not telling you to get into it. I'm not telling you this is a bad hobby. If you're just inquiring about what it's all about, plastic model building, this video is just here to bore you and just point you in a direction. That's all it is. And this is all I got for now. So I will talk to you again next time. Happy modeling. Take it easy, gang.